Several months had passed since her husband's death, but Jen was inconsolable. But when she once again came to her husband's grave, she was dumbfounded with horror. She realized that her husband had a secret that would outlive him for a long time. It was a beautiful July day. 70-year-old Jen decided to go to the grave of her husband, Frank. He died in an accident a few months ago. Jen still hasn't been able to come to terms with the loss. They never had children, and with his death, she died like a part of herself. Jen went to the flower shop that day and bought the most beautiful flowers she could find. Frank has always liked red and yellow hydrangeas, but only she knew about it. These were Frank's mother's favorite flowers. After buying flowers, Jen came to the cemetery and went to the beautiful headstone under which her husband was buried. Very soon, she learns that her whole life with Frank was not what she thought. Frank was not particularly fond of talking about his mother, and these flowers symbolized the connection that was between them. He always said that he could only talk about his mother with his wife. Only Jen knew how much these flowers meant to him. Frank's tombstone appeared in the distance, but coming up to him, Jen suddenly noticed that there were already flowers on the grave. When she saw what kind of flowers they were, she was already shaking. She couldn't believe her eyes. They were red and yellow hydrangeas. Jen, amazed, sat down next to the grave and began to think. Frank didn't have a family of his own. His parents died when he was 5 years old. Then he closed in on himself and did not let anyone into his shell. He didn't want to be friends with anyone. At his funeral, except for his wife, there were only 3 people and all were workers of the cemetery. So who could buy him these flowers? Looking around, Jen noticed something strange. There was a camera in the corner of the fence and it was pointed directly at it. Maybe it captured who brought the flowers. Jen went to the worker who was cleaning the fallen leaves. She asked if she could watch the surveillance footage of the past few days. Someone put the flowers on her husband's grave and she really wanted to know who it was. The employee hesitated at first because outsiders were not allowed to watch the videos. Of course, Jen was not satisfied with this answer. Fortunately for her, the employee was easily persuaded. Jen explained to him that her late husband had no family or friends, and hers too. She still has not recovered from his sudden death, and if she finds this mysterious stranger, they can grieve together. After these words, the employee broke down, and together they went to the office. He asked when exactly this happened. Jen figured it might have been yesterday evening. There was no one on the record at that time, but after a few minutes of viewing, they saw a man with red and yellow flowers. Realizing who it was, Jen was dumbfounded. It was a woman about her age. A staff member asked Jen if she knew her, but no, Jen had never seen her before. She stood at the grave for about 5 minutes and left. Fortunately, several cameras were working in the cemetery, and the employee turned on the image from another. There, a mysterious stranger was seen getting into the van. When he pulled out of the parking lot, Jen was able to read the writing on his side. It said, Basemore's Printing House. Jen was shocked. Her husband's surname was also Basemore. Arriving home, Jen decided to visit the same printing house of Basemore. She searched the internet and found that it was about 100 kilometers drive from her house. She got into the car and drove off. On the way, she wondered who this woman could be. Was her husband cheating on her with her? No, it was imperative to get to the bottom of the truth. After a couple of hours of driving, she arrived in Lincoln. She made a route to that company. She drove up to her, parked the car, but first decided to look around a little. After standing for half an hour, she saw that a car drove up to the building and a man got out of it. When she looked closer and realized who it was, her breath caught in her throat. It was her husband. Jen was completely shocked and bewildered. At first, she simply refused to believe her eyes. After all, she had recently buried her husband. She began to cry. Then she thought that her eyesight must have let her down. Then the thought occurred to her that she was just out of her mind. But then she decided to look through the window of this establishment. She went up to him and began to peer through the glass as best as she could. And at that very moment, right in front of her eyes, just on the other side of the window, was her husband. She froze, looked at him for a few seconds and looked away. She got so excited that she ran back to the car, got in, and drove off at full speed. As she drove away, she saw in the rearview mirror that her husband had run out and watched her go. She drove 30 kilometers and realized that she could no longer drive. She was so shocked by everything that had happened. She stopped at the side of the road and began to sob. After a while, she calmed down a bit and started the car again. On the way, she thought hard and realized that this should not be left just like that. We need to go back to it and demand an explanation. Arriving home, she remembered the day her husband died in a car accident. Yes, there was a funeral, But then she remembered that she had never seen Frank's body. She could not bear the sight and refused to look. Had they buried an empty coffin in the ground? No, that would be too much. Who did this and why? After all, they were so happy. What is the point of deceiving if Frank himself arranged it? When it was time to go to bed, the doorbell rang. Jen looked out the window. The same Basemore van was parked outside the house, and her husband stood at the door. Jen tried to pull herself together and went to the door. Yes, he is in person. She looked at him straight in the eye, and at that moment she noticed something. No, after all, it was not her husband. He introduced himself. Dan, Frank's twin brother. Jan felt sick and almost fell. How alike they are! She invited him into the house and they sat down on the sofa. She asked him why they had not met before, and then Dan told Jen about her husband, something she never expected. My brother hated me because he believed that my parents died because of me. As a child, I contracted the flu and infected them. That's why they died. Since then, Frank has never spoken to me. He continued, I asked my wife to put these flowers on his grave because I loved him anyway, and I felt very bad because we did not communicate. Jen hugged Dan. She promised to tell him everything she knew about his brother, and then they will support each other. And so it happened. They became best friends and made it a tradition to dine together every month right in the cemetery.